All right, so sorry for the back and forth there, but welcome and thank you, UCASA, for inviting us to present today. Jess and I actually had the opportunity about 2 weeks ago to present at Weber State together, so this is fun to continue working together. The topic I'll be covering is building a workplace toolkit to promote safety and belonging. Engaging with the outdoor recreation industry is going to be geared for both advocates as well as folks working in prevention. If folks just want to throw into the chat real quick, if you are, what your role is, if you're prevention or an advocate or something else. All right, looks like some advocates, mostly. Great. So do hang tight. I will get to some advocate specific things, but right now I'm going to just talk about like some prevention stuff and how we can engage with the outdoor recreation industry as a whole, as an organization. But like I said, I'll be getting to like advocate specific stuff at the end. So just a quick overview of what I'll be presenting today. I'm going to go over the 2-year impact and highlights that we have had here at Seahaven from doing this work. I'm going to go over the history, health equity, and cultural landscapes and change within the wilderness, why we should engage the outdoor recreation industry, how this work is considered primary prevention, how to engage the outdoor recreation industry, some content of our trainings. We'll have a group discussion of some practice scenarios if time allows. And finally, we'll go over the advocacy considerations I just mentioned. So getting started. In 2022, my predecessor at Seahaven, Cora Phillips, embarked on an effort to respond to harassment by leading trainings for local outdoor recreation organizations. And in the past 2 years, we have led 22 trainings to over 60 organizations, reaching over 600 people, mostly within the outdoor recreation industry. Just to give a little scope on that, Moab is about 5,000 people. Obviously, we get a lot of visitors and seasonal employees, but we've had a lot of success with this and a lot of engagement. These trainings include a short presentation, but are primarily discussion-based and have a strong engagement. And outside of our trainings, we've done other types of outreach, including collaborative webinars like this one. We've worked with Futures Without Violence and Respect Outside. We've had articles written about our work, including a piece on the cover of the Salt Lake Tribune, and we've been on the radio waves. We've received great feedback from owners, HR professionals, and from our survey we give at the end to all our participants. And I'm excited to share about our work and how we might support you in starting these conversations within your workplaces. So before we start discussing where we're headed, I think it's critical to acknowledge how we got here. This involves visiting the history of violence in these spaces and places. So I know a lot of you are advocates, but hopefully you've seen the social ecological model. It doesn't actually have this final sphere that I've added, the history piece, but I think it's a good perspective to take when we look at prevention education, to consider how did we get here in the first place? Because I feel like we have to address our history before we really can move on. Another piece of prevention that is being talked a lot about is health equity. And I don't really have a public health background, so a lot of these terms and ideas are kind of new to me. So I want to just make sure everyone's on the same page by giving a definition from the CDC. It states that health equity is in which everyone has a fair and just opportunity to attain their highest level of health. Achieving this requires ongoing societal efforts to address historical and contemporary injustices, overcome economic, social, and other obstacles to health and healthcare, and eliminate preventable health disparities. To achieve health equity, We must change the systems and policies that have resulted in the generational injustices that give rise to racial and ethnic health disparities. So before we go on, I just want to use this chance to give a content warning. We are going to be talking about some heavy subjects, so please do what you need to take care of yourself as we move through this conversation. Feel free to stand up, move around, excuse yourself. It's fine to keep your camera off, whatever you need to feel comfortable and take care of yourself. All right, so without the landscape, there would be no outdoor recreation. And unfortunately, the ideologies and preservation and conservation that drove the development of much of the American wilderness and national parks included the violent, forcible removal of indigenous people from their ancestral homelands. When these lands were made into wilderness, they were already richly inhabited by indigenous peoples who had been cultivating, conserving, and connecting with them since time immemorial. This separation from the land ignores Native peoples' traditional ecological knowledge and influence over these cultural landscapes and continues to impact their cultural and subsistence rights today. While acknowledging our history of harm, I also want to acknowledge that Utah is currently home to approximately 60,000 Indigenous individuals, representing more than 50 resilient tribal nations, with 8 being federally recognized. Each tribe has their own contemporary traditions, festivals, and lifestyles, as well as a unique heritage. Whether you're on tribal lands, in a national park, or anywhere outdoors in Utah, it's important to understand that there are strong Native ties, present and past, to these lands, even if it doesn't fit in an official category. While many nations welcome visitors for activities and events, each comes with its own set of regulations and etiquette. Do research to understand your destination and the customs of the people who live there. Native tribes that call Utah home are a vital part of our communities and continue to enrich the lives of all Utahns with their language, their stories, their land stewardship, and their customs. So aside from the history of Indigenous dispossession, a lot of barriers to accessing the outdoors continue to exist, and recreation is the main way to engage with nature, excludes a lot of people, including BIPOC folks, people from urban areas, people with differing ages, abilities, sizes, sexual orientations, and socioeconomic backgrounds. As we understand our collective history and the harm and violence caused within those histories, I hope that we are more clearly able to work towards disrupting those systems and ideologies and working towards repair and inclusion. Fortunately, there are a lot of organizations, many of which are global majority led, working to increase belonging to groups previously excluded in outdoor recreational activities and spaces. It is my hope that this conversation and training contributes to that effort. And we definitely have some organizations listed here that you might recognize. Some are within Utah. The National Ability Center has a program here. I know they're mostly up in Park City. Canyonlands Field Institute is here locally in Moab. They have an Indigenous guide training trip. There's a lot of great organizations out there trying to bring folks into this space. So if folks get thrown to the chat, what barriers do you experience in accessing the outdoors? Feel free to put stuff in the chat. Working hours, yep. Fees to state parks, thanks, Nicoletta. Working hours. Yeah, time. It's not called leisure recreation for nothing. Gas prices, yeah, absolutely. Travel distance, physical abilities, yep. Yeah, beginner spaces, absolutely. Lack of knowledge. Yep. Yep. we have often in our minds a vision of who participates in these activities, and I don't feel like all of us fit into that perspective. Too many murder podcasts. Fair enough. Yep. Yeah. All right. It looks like we can all relate to experiencing barriers here in accessing the outdoors. All right. I know that was that history is a little bit dark, and it's unfortunately has a lot of violence and exclusion seeped into it. But moving forward, I think we can all find some tools to help make these places safer. All right, so why should we engage with the outdoor recreation industry when it comes to sexual violence? Well, it's a primary driver for the tourism industry in Utah, and many communities have an economy and workforce tied to tourism. I know Moab, it's one of our biggest work areas. And according to the Utah Division of Outdoor Recreation, the industry contributes more than $6.1 billion to the economy and employs more than 66,000 people. That's a lot of money and a lot of people to reach. Utah is all about outdoor recreation, kind of like Andy was saying in the beginning, and is known for many amazing outdoor activities. It is home to 5 national parks, 44 state parks, 9 national monuments, 5 national forests, and 2 national recreation areas. Almost 42% of Utah outdoors is made up of public land. All right, so folks can throw into the chat what you do enjoy doing in the outdoors. And it doesn't have to be rock climbing or something like that. It can be stargazing, working in your garden, anything you enjoy doing outside. Camping, backpacking, fishing, kayaking, walking, taking photos, yeah, reading, paddleboarding, just being outside. Yep, going to the park, horseback riding, paddleboarding, snowboarding, grilling, yep. Skiing, that's a big one in Utah. All right, thanks for sharing. Yeah, so it sounds like even though people have some barriers to the outdoors, sounds like a lot of you still really enjoy connecting to being outside, whether it's reading a book outside or doing something more technical like skiing. And Andy was speaking to a lot of this earlier, but we have a vast landscape that ranges from snow-capped mountains to wild rivers and colorful red rock canyons. Yet there's not nearly enough inclusion to make these spaces safe and representative of the entire public, which needs prioritized. If we increase safety and belonging in these spaces, then 22.8 million acres across Utah will become more welcoming to people from across the globe. According to a recent National Park Service survey, about 78% of those who visit federal parks are white. Meanwhile, African American, Latinos, women, and members of the LGBTQ+ community often report feeling unwelcome or unsafe in the outdoor spaces. Additionally, the outdoor industry workforce, which includes everyone from park rangers to retail sales associates, has minimal representation from those groups. Without making these spaces safer, people cannot truly belong. So a multitude of studies have shown that sexual violence is pervasive across outdoor recreation activities. We all know that sexual violence is far too prevalent, and the data in these spaces exceeds national numbers for harassment. A survey by Outside Business Journal found that 1 in 2 women and 1 in 5 men experience sexual harassment or assault while working in the outdoor industry. The CDC reports that 1 in 3 women and 1 in 9 men have experienced sexual harassment. So why are these numbers higher in the outdoor recreation industry? There are many factors that contribute to these statistics. Many of them are present in outdoor recreation settings and workplaces. Some identified by the EEOC include a homogeneous workforce that is single-sex dominated or lacks diversity, a rough and tumble place that doesn't conform to norms by accepting raunchy jokes, remarks, or banter, physically isolated environments and in interactions. Most of these folks are working away in backcountry wilderness areas. A significant number of young adults occupy these roles. Unfortunately, they're not very high-paying roles, and often they're seasonal jobs for younger folks. Wages are connected to customer service and satisfaction. There are often gendered power disparities in a hierarchy. Senior staff and special titles lead to higher value among certain staff. Alcohol is often tolerated during and around work hours. And finally, supervisors are typically removed from first-line staff. Fortunately, though, if you look at the climate, recreationalists seem to be wanting to have these conversations. Just as there are organizations doing work to increase diversity and belonging, there are currently strong community efforts to minimize violence in these spaces. I believe folks in this industry are primed and ready for tools and resources to keep this work going. Many of the outdoor recreation communities are gathering data and stories on how pervasive harassment is within their work and recreational spaces. Voices of people experiencing harassment are being elevated, and organizations are working to hold people accountable. Work is being done to recognize the issues and find solutions. But there's still a lot of work to be done to make these places safer for all. So, thinking about who you could reach in your community, go ahead and throw into the chat what outdoor recreation industries exist in your community. Skiing and climbing, yep. Most of them, yeah. Yeah, skiing, mountain biking, everything. Southern Utah, yep. Swimming, snowboarding, climbing, hiking.
Masters +5.
River running, yep. Yeah, I know here in Moab we have a lot of different organizations, and some are multi-sport, some are single sport, but we have a wide variety. Trail running, yep. All right, so hopefully I'm starting to build a case as to why we should engage with the outdoor recreation industry. But you might be asking yourself, how is this even considered primary prevention, or how do sexual violence organizations contribute to this effort? Well, I'm going to go over my case for how I believe this work, including bystander intervention, is primary prevention, and I'll discuss who we are reaching through these efforts and how we are hopefully stopping violence before it begins. So going back to the social ecological model, simply put, primary prevention stops violence before it even occurs. One of the aims of primary prevention is to change the characteristics and conditions of environments and settings through which people move. These approaches have the potential to impact community members that may not engage directly with individual programming. So again, if you look at this circle, I've highlighted community, environment, and organizational. So when we're engaging at this level, by going into like workplaces, we're hoping that we're getting more of a cultural shift within a whole organization, and we're moving further away from just that individual education. So it's our hope that these trainings extend into this broad societal factors that help create a climate in which violence is inhibited by increasing protective factors and decreasing risk factors for sexual violence. Efforts to change cultural norms, behaviors, and practices within the workforce is moving us upstream to stop violence from occurring in the first place. So following the evidence-based strategies and approaches from the CDC's Stop Sexual Violence Technical Package, for those preventionists out there, we utilize two approaches to promote these social norms. We use bystander intervention, which engages individuals to change social norms and provide leadership around preventing sexual violence. And we mobilize men and boys as allies in another approach, which is well suited for the outdoor recreation industry due to the fact that the industry can be predominantly male. These approaches provide an opportunity to encourage men and boys to be allies in preventing sexual and relationship violence. Such approaches work to foster healthy, positive norms about masculinity, gender, and violence among individuals, with potential for these social norms to spread through their social networks. So I have to say, there are a lot of rafting companies I've done trainings for where this male-female ratio does seem to be shifting. However, Zippia reports in their outdoor guide demographics and statistics that the majority of people in this occupation are college-educated, white, young, and male. Probably not entirely surprising. The seasonality of these jobs also means that they're often short-term endeavors on the way to other employment opportunities or summer job during college. So aside from utilizing upstream prevention as the best metaphor ever, especially when talking to the river community, there is actually a lot of upstream prevention happening here. By engaging with these groups, I hope that we can mobilize men and boys as allies as they embark into the world, give tools and cultivate conversations that will be taken to college campuses, recreational pursuits, future employment. Hopefully we're setting boundaries and expectations around behavior for national and global visitors, since guides are often the ones engaging with visitors of our communities. I hope that we're increasing inclusion and belonging within these workplaces and recreational spaces so that we can get more representation. And finally, I hope that we're shifting cultural beliefs and attitudes by igniting conversations that will decrease harassment and violence. So now that I've talked about the whys and hopefully built a good case for how this work is important, how it's relevant to sexual assault and domestic violence organizations, I'm going to just talk a little bit about how I do this work. So being in a familiar environment is probably one of the best ways to engage with these folks, since so much of the work is place-based. So meeting people where they're at definitely can make people feel more comfortable and engaged. Much of this is centered around the outdoors. So moving into familiar spaces with these folks can mean discussing scenarios around a campfire, leading a training on a remote section of river, or even giving a PowerPoint presentation in like a dingy old warehouse surrounded by coolers and guides that haven't showered for a week. I actually partnered with some folks in Vernal to deliver a training, and this was absolutely our setting. I wasn't on this training trip in this picture, but Cora did go on a multi-day river trip to deliver this training. I think that Jess said it pretty well in one of her trainings, where the outdoors has a way of kind of cracking us open and being vulnerable and having really in-depth conversations and high engagement. So I think there's a lot of magic in these spaces. Another thing to kind of think about is expanding folks' risk management lens beyond environmental and physical safety to include emotional and psychological safety. So working in the outdoor recreation industry requires several trainings and certificates that center around risk management. When you operate in remote areas, often without cell service or roads, these folks are tasked with having quite a lot of expertise, including but not limited to medical trainings, swift water rescue training, climbing rescue techniques, and avalanche knowledge. Applying risk management to emotional and psychological safety feels like a pretty natural progression when we frame our work that way. The Responder Alliance and other industry leaders are already acknowledging a shift from this technical risk management lens to one that includes psychological and mental first aid, as well as protocols for traumatic events and stress injury. Bystander intervention is one more step in that direction. So the next few slides are actually from the training I deliver from our bystander training to just kind of give you more of a sense of how I might deliver this information. So as with any group, using culturally relevant language and imagery is important. Once you're physically with them in a familiar place, using that culturally relevant language and imagery becomes important. Here's an example where I use a pretty common safety issue, dehydration, and apply it to the escalation of behavior. I talk to them about addressing things when they're small before they become more dangerous. Just like you would address somebody who's not drinking water, showing signs of dehydration, you want to start giving them water before they get heat stroke. Many outdoor recreation jobs require leadership, and here's an example of how I would engage that strength by making a call to their leadership abilities. In these ways, I'm engaging with their common language and strengths, helping apply their leadership and risk management skills to creating safer places. All right, so now that you've had a glimpse of how I might talk directly to an outdoor recreation audience, I'm going to go over a few more slides that I include in my training. Do pay attention because if we have some time, I am going to have us go over a scenario or two and throw our answers into the chat. So the slide portion of our training is about 20 minutes. And of course, we modify this to be used in whatever setting we need. If it's in the backcountry, we would not have our computer and we would need to plan accordingly. But we always go over learning outcomes. We discuss the impact to the bottom line. This is particularly helpful for owners and managers to realize that, hey, this isn't just good for the ethics of the company, but it's actually going to help the financial piece. We talk about reasons people don't respond to harm, and then we go over the 5 Ds of bystander intervention. So we talk about distract, delegate, two forms of, or 2 ways to approach a situation where there's harm. And we give relevant examples. So what that might look like is distracting would say something like, hey, what did you think of that big horned sheep we saw at lunch? So bringing in scenarios they might actually be able to use, or like, hey, can you come help me move this heavy cooler? By having this conversation with the entire team, it ensures that everyone is on the same page when delegating a helper becomes the most effective intervention so that we can discuss ways in which they can use this tool effectively. And they're having this conversation with each other so that they're setting up the expectations beforehand. So having supervisors and managers in on this training is really important when it comes to documentation. Most organizations have incident and accident reports, and it's a great way when they ensure those forms extend to behaviors and are formatted to do so. It also helps that staff know what their workplace's policies are. And I've even had managers say, hey, we don't really have these protective policies. Like, we're going to go back and make sure that we're supporting our staff to be safe by looking at our policy and procedure. So we talk about documentation, delay and check-in. We remind folks it's never too late to act, and delaying an intervention can sometimes be the best way to approach a situation. I remind folks to regularly check in with a group, to reframe expectations so that they're not singling folks out. And then finally, we encourage people to be direct when it's appropriate and safe by giving them some ideas of what that would sound like in their specific situations. We always remind folks too of what a bystander is and what a bystander is not, because of course, safety is always the priority. This also kind of alleviates people feeling like they need to solve all the problems, just letting them know that their job is to listen, be supportive, and share resources. We introduce a few other concepts, which include DARBO, which is a common reaction to be aware of when a perpetrator is being held accountable for their behavior. We go over consent in a very explicit way with the acronyms FRIES. A lot of times, just basic everyday consent is being broken, and that's where the harm is coming from. We also discuss the flight, fight, freeze, and fawn response to discomfort and danger. We feel this is important for people to understand the array of responses to increase their ability to respond. We package the toolkit with the 5 Rs in hopes that people are walking away with the ability to recognize harmful behavior, options for responding, where to refer folks who might need additional help. So generally, I bring somebody from our client services department, like an advocate, to give a brief overview of our organization and the services we offer. And finally, we encourage them to restore accountability and re-engage with change outside of the moment. So that usually involves looking at their policies and creating a more of an organizational structure to support these ideas. If an organization wants to focus on something specific, we add that in. Some activities I've led are understanding our multifaceted identities, using the identity wheel, discussions of implicit and explicit bias, and discussions exploring gender dynamics and socialization. I think these are important activities because a lot of time harm comes from this bias, these biases we carry. After the short PowerPoint presentation section of the training, we spend about an hour going over scenarios. I tell folks just like they would practice CPR and first aid or any other skill they might need in a high stress situation. We practice these active bystander techniques so that we have some muscle memory when we're responding in a likely tense situation. All right. So I was going to have folks participate in some practice scenarios. Does anyone have any questions off the bat before we jump into these? If you do, feel free to throw it into the chat. All right, I'm not seeing any questions right now. So I'm going to read through some scenarios, and I'd like you to choose which of the 5 Ds you choose and put that into the chat. If you'd like to give an example of what you'd say, that is great. Or you can answer one of the other prompts. The scenarios are broad and somewhat ambiguous on purpose. Oftentimes when we witness something happen, we might not have all the details or context. Since I don't know y'all's background, I made the scenarios from a perspective that you're a guest on an outdoor recreation trip. All right, so on the left is the scenario and on the right are prompts. And again, you're gonna throw into the chat which D you would use to respond to the scenario, and you're welcome to elaborate if you'd like or answer any of the prompts. So the scenario is, you are a guest on a multi-day rafting trip. You witness another guest rubbing the shoulders of a guide, praising them for working so hard that day. The guide appears uncomfortable. What are some thoughts? What are folks' ideas on how you might respond to that situation? Distract. Ask the guide to help me with something so they can leave the situation. Yeah, can you help me? Yeah, thanks for sharing. Feel free to throw in anything else that you can think of. I like to give scenarios that aren't like very highly egregious, something that's kind of nuanced, so that they can start thinking about that escalation of violence. All right, the second scenario. You're a client on a hiking trip. A guide is carrying a sizable pack on a hike. A guest takes the backpack off the guide's shoulders and says, "I'll carry that." What comes to mind when you think of this situation? And what might you say? So it's the guide's job to hold on to all materials for the group, so they need to keep it. Yes, absolutely. Kind of falling back on like a policy or rule. Direct action. Yep. Asking them why they felt the need to take the pack. Directly ask. Yes, I love that. This is something I cover a lot with people. I tell them I'm not the fun police, that I'm really just there to help them make sure that they're in a space with their colleagues and their guests where everyone feels safe. And, you know, some people are okay with certain things, but we can't assume that. So yeah, I love the idea of asking, are you okay with that? Yeah, we usually follow up with this one and talk about consent. Just reminding people these are things, because the lines can get kind of blurry when you are not confined within walls. There's not a lot of privacy necessarily. Sometimes you are required to like physically assist people. Great, thanks for these ideas. All right, another scenario. You hear a guest asking a guide about their relationship status. The guest then begins to play matchmaker and states how the guide should go on a date with their friend or relative. Does anyone have any ideas? Yep, after the tour, yep, that's a good idea. Delay and check in. Ask the guide later if they were okay with that or not. Yeah, and I think to add to that, you could always ask if they say they're not okay with what happened, asking them, hey, how can I support you in the future, especially if you're like on a multi-day trip? Because everybody has probably a preference of how they want to be supported in those situations. Another idea I've thrown out to folks is like reminding people before a trip. So really talking about behavior expectations before a trip, or if there's like a wrap up on a multi-day trip at the end of the day. So like sitting around dinner or the campfire, just reminding people of like the expectations that you said in the beginning, and referencing things that you've been seeing and how that might not be falling in line with what you originally asked the people to agree to. All right, this is the last one. So you're a guest on a Jeep tour. A guide is bent over to fix a flat tire. You notice two guests gawking behind them. Yeah, I love that. Uh, you could say a lot with your body language. So yeah, you could just walk in front of them and make it obvious that you see what they're doing. Yeah, direct action, tell them it's not okay. Distract them with starting a conversation. Yeah, I think all of these are great suggestions. Something I always just try to help participants realize is there's no right or wrong way to respond. It's that you respond somehow, and everybody's going to feel different. And the power dynamic is probably different. If you're another guest on this trip versus like the trip leader, your power dynamic will be different. So just knowing that there's multiple tools to select can help us determine which is the best for the situation. All right. Thank you for all of your participation. Hopefully that was a fun exercise to kind of realize where we're going with this training when we deliver it to people in the workplaces, and the kind of conversations that ensue. So I think this part of the training is one of the most essential parts. And like I said earlier, I spend about an hour listening to and facilitating these conversations. I like to have managers as well as field staff, owners, et cetera, coming together and using these hypotheticals to set the tone and expectations for the way they want to create their workplace culture. I've seen people bring in real life scenarios into these situations and have really vulnerable dialogues. And especially for teams that work together year after year, I think sometimes it's the first time they've had facilitation around these conversations, or have even shared some of the negative experiences they've had. And it gives them the space to say, hey, I don't like this behavior, and this is how I want you as my colleagues to support me if you see it in the future. I really believe this is where the magic happens. These conversations and scenario cards go out into the field with folks. They get incorporated into pre and post trip meetings. They keep happening after we have these conversations within the training. So they continue to utilize additional scenarios I often give them to have the conversation throughout the season, which I think just really brings it home. All right, so those of you that are advocates, thank you for listening to the prevention pieces that we do here through our bystander intervention trainings. But I am going to talk now about how we might interact with these people more from the after the harm has happened, or how we can connect people to our services that are advocates. So just some things to consider about people that work in this industry. And of course, these are generalizations. Everybody or every situation is going to be different, but these are some themes. Many folks within this population are transient and potentially without traditional housing. And I think it's a choice, but it does decrease some of that privacy and security. Additionally, some of these folks may have staff housing that is co-ed, but again, doesn't have that adequate privacy, which can, impact power differentials and really have them at a risk of being in a domestic violence situation with quite a lot of people. Also, there's issues with being employed by or housed by your employer. There can be some abuse that occurs to folks, and they might not want to say anything because they would lose their housing as well as their job. Another consideration is that a lot of folks working in this industry are in isolated environments, meaning that sort of the front country resources such as cell service, other bystanders, medical practitioners, and law enforcement may be limited. They might only have the people they're out there with and potentially some satellite communication. But if they need help, it could be hours, if not days, before they get a response. And many of these activities involve some amount of risk-taking behavior. And again, this is a generalization, but I think folks that are engaging in these activities sometimes have a higher risk tolerance than folks within more mainstream sports. And then with that transient piece, many people may not have close proximity to their support networks. So we see a lot of people come to Moab for seasonal jobs, and they may be coming from the East Coast or another country. So they may not have anyone within a near close vicinity that can support them and that they trust. And with that, people may not have knowledge of local resources. So I think it's important to understand these folks, where they're coming from and how they might struggle to get connected to resources. So questions to consider within your organization. What support can your organization offer this population? What considerations might we have when working with people not traditionally housed or that are temporarily within our community or just traveling through? That's another thing. We get a lot of people traveling through, and I don't know about everyone else on this call, but I know that traveling can be stressful. And we all know that, like, if there's a volatile or unhealthy relationship and you add stress and newness and discomfort, things can escalate. So trying to figure out how we can connect with people who are not aware of our resources. How can we increase awareness to this population when they might not have knowledge of many local resources? So things that we've considered are flyers in like gas stations, stickers in restaurant bathrooms, showering facilities. If you're traveling through and you're camping, you might still want to take a shower even though you're not at a hotel. So kind of thinking about where these people might be and if your resource information is in those spaces. So how can we work with other agencies and workplaces to build partnerships of support and awareness? So maybe you just go give a flyer to workplaces that workplaces that have outdoor rec individuals working there. So, sometimes I've delivered these trainings and then I leave a flyer for them to put in their bathroom, which is going to be used by not only their staff, but their guests, in case their guests are in a situation where they need support. And kind of leading into what Jess is going to talk about, talking to these people about how you might partner as an organization to develop these spaces as healing places. So maybe you have a group that leads hiking. And maybe you talk to them about having hiking for survivors, where survivors are out in the wilderness connecting with other survivors. They're moving their bodies. They're with a group where they feel safe. I know that an organization in town, they do mental health hikes. So they're trying to reach out to folks that enjoy connecting with others in the outdoors, but it's not super technical skill set. They're just walking, talking, and connecting people. Does anybody have any ideas when I ask these questions about what your organization could do, or does it bring up ways that you have connected with people? I get the question a lot in my trainings that because most people know that Moab has a lot of tourists. They ask if we, Sea Haven, serve a lot of tourists. And while we sometimes do, it's not a large part of the people we serve. And so that makes me think that there's probably an access issue. Perhaps people just don't know who to call unless they have a run-in with law enforcement, in which case they would refer them to us. All right. I just wanted to put this out there. This is the first time I'm announcing this, but we have had a lot of people reach out and wanting just a little bit more information on how to do this bystander training. And we are in the process of putting together a train the trainer. So it will be specific for SA and DV organizations. We would work with your prevention departments. We would kind of walk through how we would do this, help them brainstorm who they might reach out to in their communities, get them some slides. So we're really excited about this. We hope it's something useful for your organizations. And hopefully if folks have this going on in their prevention department, it's starting to help advocates and sort of the client service side understand these spaces more, understand these people more, potentially providing healing spaces, or even just more access to response in case there is violence happening in these areas. So if you're interested in signing up for this Train the Trainer, it'll probably be coming up in the next few months. I'm hopeful to do it this spring. I have my email in the next slide, and I would just love for folks to reach out and let me know you're interested. And when I get it developed and I'm ready to launch it, I will hopefully have a list of folks that I can reach out to. So I want to thank you all for your participation and joining me for this presentation. I hope it's inspired you with tools, content, and ideas of how to engage members of your own outdoor recreation community. I have my email address here and would be happy to collaborate with you on developing this type of training where you see a need. And I am going to transition us over to Jess here in just a second, but I'm talking about the prevention piece. Hopefully we're both raising the awareness piece, but Jess will be talking about the response piece, and we see it sort of as this Venn diagram. All three are needed to really provide safety within our communities. And so Jess, I will pass it over to you. Thank you so much, everyone.
All right. Thank you so much, Ariel, for that presentation. Every time I watch it and learn more, I just am always inspired by the amazing bystander intervention work you're doing in that prevention piece. So I will start sharing my screen. Okay. And so, as Ariel had described, we're going to be thinking now on the response side. So when somebody's a survivor of interpersonal violence, often there is trauma that is involved, as most of you advocates know. So how do we create community in outdoor spaces? How can outdoor spaces be healing? Anecdotally, so not only do I do the Women's Center work here at Weber State, but I'm also a rock climbing instructor, and I teach a couple of classes, which we'll talk a little bit more about. But I've noticed that there is a big overlap in clients that I work with and people who get into outdoor recreation in some capacity. So it's really interesting to think about how we can be more intentional with our outdoor spaces to make sure survivors feel included, safe, and that they can push their own boundaries. So we're going to talk a little bit about climbing community first. So climbing and having a community is not a new thing. So when we look historically at contemporary rock climbing from the 1950s on, we know that it's a bunch of misfits rebelling against society. So a lot of folks that were hippies in the 60s and 70s who were trying to get away from just our mainstream world. So you can see some historical photos of climbers in the 60s and 70s. We've got Verm the Vermin Sherman, who's the guy with the beer bottle bouldering. And then we have some other folks in Yosemite. And so again, this group of misfits having a really great time, community, making this community. But what do we notice about this community? Who might be missing here? And feel free to put it in the chat. Women, absolutely. They're all white dudes, correct? Yeah. People of color, absolutely. Women, people of color. Yeah. Other thoughts? They all look pretty physically able. They all have a very similar body type, very fit. Yeah, and this is often for a very long time in climbing, it has been seen as a very exclusionary sport. So a lot of cis, hetero, white dudes who are able-bodied and have the privilege to go off-grid. Because when we think about it, that takes a lot of privilege in and of itself to be able to get away from work life and just live in the mountains and climb. It, in essence, is a privilege of class as well. So, but what's been interesting in the past 10, 15 years in the climbing world is that we have been creating very intentional affinity spaces. So what an affinity space is a place for people who share a specific identity or commonality to come together in an atmosphere of inherent shared understanding. So, for example, so we have the Ladies Climbing Coalition in Ogden. So we are for anyone who identifies as a gender marginalized person. So maybe they're a woman, maybe they're gender non-binary, but we want to create a space where people have those commonalities where they feel safer to experience climbing. And that's not the only place we're seeing this. So I have a few examples from across the country and a couple that are in our own backyard. So we have Flash Foxy. So that's the picture on the top left. Flash Foxy is for women and genderqueer climbers to come together and learn more about the sport. They're a fantastic organization. They do a ton of work. They have two main festivals, one in North Conway in New Hampshire and one in Bishop, California. And they have scholarships for people to participate. They also have a great way of creating community across the country. So a really fantastic space where you don't need to have any experience climbing. You just have to have the passion to go. We also have Adaptive Climbing Group. So that would be the one on the top right. So thinking about people with different ability levels. Everyone should be able to experience the outdoors in whatever ways they're able. And so thinking creatively, how do we make climbing spaces open to people with different physical abilities? We also have the Climbers of Color group, and they are fantastic. So bottom left, they are doing a lot of not only creating community spaces and creating guiding programs for people of color in Seattle, Washington, but they're also working on bigger issues when it comes to the American Mountain Guide Association. So creating more intentional spaces for diverse populations, even down to considering helmets. So if somebody has an afro, for instance, a general helmet might not fit them correctly and might not be safe or effective. So they are working with companies to make sure that those helmets are correct. So they're doing a lot of fantastic work as well. And then we, of course, have SLAC, our Salt Lake Area Queer Climbers Coalition. They have weekly meetups and create support spaces for queer climbers. They also work really closely with us up here at Weber State. They come to our Ogden Climbing Festival every year and make sure to have affinity spaces for our queer climbers. So it's really heartening when we think about the climbing world that it is changing. It might be a slow change, but it's changing. So I think that that's really important. And that's where classes like risk resilience and rock climbing come in. So this is a course that is a blended women and gender studies course, and then an outdoor recreation course here at Weber State, where we explore the intersections of rock climbing, interpersonal and intrapersonal growth. So how do we create community while also being supported and safe? And then women and gender studies. So thinking about climbing in this intersectional joke. And so, wait, let me see that chat again. Hold, please. Can someone get that for me? Oh no, I saw it and it went away. Okay, I got it. My husband is Black and jokes good is serious about how after slavery, why would people want to be outside? So I think it's great to see people working on opening up the outdoorsy recreation world. Absolutely. So I have seen this joke through other communities as well. Right? Thinking about, again, the privilege to go outdoors. Who has access? Who feels safe? Who is seen outdoors? And so seeing that changing and representation matters, right? So seeing other people of color and seeing other queer folks outdoors, seeing women outdoors is heartening and creates a space where it's like, okay, maybe I can do this, or maybe why not try it? Absolutely. So this course at Weber, we also look at power and privilege in the climbing world. So again, thinking back to that helmet, right? Who has the privilege to wear a helmet that's safe? Who has the ability to afford all the climbing gear? So thinking about how we are creating a safer and brave space as climbers and how to make it more inclusive, intersectional, and accessible to people from, again, a variety of backgrounds. So how does this relate to advocacy? So I do want to give a content warning. Again, we will not be going into detail about any form of sexual assault or domestic violence, but we will be talking about statistics. I know we're all advocates in the room, and so we're very used to these conversations, but if you do need to step away at any point, do not hesitate and take care of yourself. So in the context of my work at Weber State, we really are focused in on college students here. However, we can talk about the larger numbers, and we will in a little bit when it comes to climbers. So what we know, college level, 19% of college women and 6% of college men are sexually assaulted during college. 13% of college women report stalking. 43% of dating college women, so almost half, report some form of dating violence during college. So almost half. And we know 90% are committed by known perpetrators. So I'm sure these statistics are not surprising to anyone in the room, but unfortunately, they're really high. We also know that rates are higher among LGBTQ plus students of color, undocumented students, and students with disabilities. This is not because of that identity, but it's the fact that perpetrators often utilize power and privilege in situations to manipulate survivors who might share some of those identities. So for example, if a student is an undocumented student, their abuser might threaten to call ICE on them or their family. That might be a way of utilizing that privilege and power in society. Or a queer student's partner might threaten to out them to their family. So again, it's not the identity that's causing this, it's the marginalization by those perpetrators that is the root cause there. We also know that in the state of Utah, about 1 in 10 folks have experienced some form of sexual violence. 88% of Utah survivors do not report to law enforcement. And then 40% of our homicides are DV related. So again, our state is an amazing state. We are extremely low in most forms of crime, except when it comes to rape, domestic violence, child abuse, and child sexual abuse, which is why we're all fighting the good fight and why I'm so grateful to have all of you here wanting to learn more about this stuff. So I'm really, really grateful to have everyone in the room today. So when we think about sexual assault and sexual harassment, we often don't think about that in our outdoor recreation. We don't often think of these as correlated. There was a study done by the American Alpine Club called Safe Outside, which was done back in 2018, 2019, about sexual harassment and sexual assault in the climbing community. So there have always been conversations because, again, the people who have the most power and privilege in climbing spaces historically have been cis white men. So we wanted to talk about, okay, like, is there sexual assault and harassment happening in the climbing world? And unfortunately, there is, and not just impacting women, but also impacting men. So when we look at, they had participants from across the globe. They had, I can't remember exactly how many people, but it was a very large study. It was pretty impressive data. And unfortunately, pretty surprising. Let's 5,000, thank you. 5,000 plus, thanks, Ariel. So 16% of men during climbing activities and 47, so again, almost half of women experienced some form of sexual harassment or sexual assault while climbing. So this isn't just in daily life, but while they are climbing. When we look at the specific types of sexual harassment and sexual assault that we see while climbing, we see both men and women are about half of the folks who were surveyed had been catcalled. There was also verbal harassment was extremely high. Even unwanted following for women was pretty darn high, as well as unwanted touching. Men experienced more flashing. But then we also see that there was forcible kissing, 7% of women, 4% of men, unwanted sex acts, and even rape happens while climbing. So these are some huge issues that the Safe Outside data has brought to the attention of the climbing community. This is a huge issue. We also see that men predominantly experience one type of sexual harassment or sexual assault, whereas women are a little bit more split between 1 to 3 types. So again, having compiled experiences of sexual assault or sexual harassment. So this is an issue. So not only do we notice that climbers are experiencing these things, but also a lot of survivors try to find safe spaces in the outdoors because it can be so healing, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But it's complicated when we see this data and how that can actually super negatively impact survivors. So when we look at that data, continuing to look at how it impacted survivors, respondents reported that after experiencing the sexual harassment or assault, they changed how they engaged with climbing in 3 main ways. So some people disengaged from the climbing community altogether. You know, after something traumatic happens while doing the sport, they were like, you know what, this isn't a safe space for me. I'm going to do something different. Other folks reduced or eliminated travel for climbing. So really only climbing right near home where they feel safe. And as climbers, there's so much amazing climbing in our country and across the world. Unfortunately, like limiting that travel, again, we acknowledge that that is a privilege, but not being able to travel due to fear is an unfortunate repercussion. Also, limiting climbing activities to specific groups or people. So if somebody was sexually assaulted, maybe they only climb with people who share their gender identity after that. So as I was saying, we know a lot of survivors. We see that this happens in the climbing community. We see that this happens in college communities, but we also know that nature is extremely beneficial for survivors. And we can talk about it in terms of climbing, but also going in our gardens, taking a hike, taking a walk, taking photos. All of these things can be extremely beneficial to survivors. So survivors can learn to manage their emotions in an environment that can feel out of control. So when we're outdoors, stuff happens that we don't have control over, like rain or wind or it might get really hot, or it might get really cold. So survivors utilizing that space as a safe container for practicing to push their boundaries in a way that's relatively safe can help them learn to manage those emotions and ground. Survivors can find ways to feel safe and set clear boundaries. So in the climbing context, in every single climbing class I teach, we have to talk about boundaries. So if somebody doesn't want to finish a climb, consent is mandatory. They don't have to finish the climb. We can absolutely lower them. Checking harnesses. So you're getting into somebody's personal space to check where their harness is. So always asking permission before we do that. Making sure that survivors can say yes or no. A survivor can experience their body as a powerful, supportive, and full of vital information. So when we're in nature, we're often more connected to our body, or if we're doing a sport outside, we're more connected to our body, what it's saying. Many survivors have been told to tamp down their feelings, not trust their gut. And so when we're outside in nature, sometimes we have to. So really experiencing their body as that powerful space of information. And as we know, nature enhances feelings of calmness as well as decreasing feelings of anger. Again, it can promote positive emotional states. So being outside in the beauty of nature, again, we live in such a beautiful place, can really make people feel positive. It can connect survivors with their spirituality, whatever that looks like to them. Again, being present in the body, cultivating a positive relationship to self. I've worked with clients where they get to the top of the climb and they go, wow, my body could do that. I am so strong. Holy crap. And so having that positive relationship to self in regards to these sports can be super empowering. And then experiencing a greater acceptance and authenticity to self. So if you are interested in this type of work, again, it doesn't just have to be rock climbing. This could be doing a hike as part of a support group. This could be walking in the park. There's a lot of different ways that we can create these spaces. So I'm giving some tips that I've learned after doing supportive trauma-informed climbing classes with survivors, some things I've learned. And also, if you are interested in working together for different places to support survivors in climbing spaces, I'd love to geek out with you more. But what I've learned, small steps. So when I'm teaching climbing skills, I'm doing a very slow and steady pace, not to overwhelm folks. Because if you've never climbed before, climbing's scary. Our brains, naturally, our amygdala is working and it's saying, hey, we shouldn't be this high off the ground. Unless maybe you're Alex Honnold, the free soloer, right? His brain doesn't work quite the same way ours does. But so working with survivors, teaching skills at a slow, reasonable pace to make sure that they are not being overwhelmed. Consent is mandatory. Be sure to give survivors a safe space to say no. If they don't want to finish the climb, that's okay. We can absolutely lower them. If they aren't feeling comfortable rappelling, that can be really scary. So rappelling is going off the edge on a rope and lowering yourself. That can be really scary. That takes a lot of trust of the equipment and the instructor. It's okay if somebody doesn't want to do that. Making sure to give spaces for consent and for somebody to be able to respectfully say no and be heard. Also, group trust building. These events shouldn't be a one and done situation typically. It should be creating that group and building rapport over time. Again, we can do one and dones, but it can be really beneficial to do slow and small steps and have folks learn and grow together and create that space of positive rapport for each other. Also, as the facilitator or the guide, making sure to be respectful and positive to every client. This will also show the participants to be respectful and positive as well. And we also know if it's not just a space for survivors, so regardless of where I'm teaching, I most likely have survivors in the room. They might not have disclosed that to me, and that is totally okay. But we want to make sure we're treating everybody equitably and with respect and positivity. Also, having accountability and boundaries. We need those things to exist in the world. So holding ourselves and our participants accountable. So if we say something that's hurtful or problematic, it's kind of a cheesy rule, but it seems to work, saying ouch and oops. So if somebody has a microaggression that they say, maybe saying, ouch, I didn't like that. And then that person can apologize, oops. So having them have that space to be able to be brave and make mistakes, but also be held accountable. Respecting each other's boundaries is very important, and make sure that your boundaries as an instructor or a guide are also respected. So really being sure to get those boundaries and accountability pieces at the beginning. So in our risk resilience and rock climbing class, we do group guidelines the first day of class, and we make sure everyone understands them and everyone is in agreement. And so if we have to utilize any of those rules throughout the semester, we can always go back to that space. Also having culminating discussions. So again, doing a lot of the work beforehand to explain this is what we're doing, this is what you'll need, here are our group guidelines. But at the end, checking in with everybody. What was exciting today? What was the coolest thing you did? What was the hardest thing you did? Did you notice somebody else pushing themselves? What was that like? Can we gas up our friends? So giving our participants space and time to process after the day's lesson is key to really be able to decompress and talk through what they've experienced. Any questions so far? Okay, well, I will keep on trucking along. So when we think about trauma and supporting survivors in climbing spaces, we have to acknowledge that trauma is very dependent on the survivor. Every survivor's experience with trauma is different. So we need to make sure that we are acknowledging that and being very intentional in checking in with our participants. But however, there are some common patterns that you can check in with participants on if you're noticing these things while being outdoors with clients. So sometimes to check in, survivors may rebel. Survivors might not be into it. They might be in that fight mode in their amygdala, feeling a little bit scared about what's happening. I don't trust that anchor. Why does the anchor look like that? Why are you making me go over this edge? Are you crazy? Right? Those types of things. So saying, hey, you don't have to do anything. And also explaining why rules are in place, why that anchor works, why this gear could actually hold a truck that's moving, explaining what we're doing and how we're doing it, and also explanations of why rules are in place. So for example, if a client is frustrated that they don't want to have to wear a harness tight, it feels uncomfortable. Explaining the reason we do have to wear it relatively tight on our waist is so if we fall upside down, that harness can catch us. So explaining the reasons why can also help. If another one that we do a lot in climbing that people can be frustrated about is we have to have our hair put back. And that's because we utilize gear that hair can get stuck in. And we don't want anybody to have bald patches. So explaining the why we need to do things a certain way, and not that it's just a rule to be a rule. Some survivors may have trouble expressing their feelings. So being sure to check in with everyone, not just the folks that you know are survivors, but everyone, to make sure that they're doing okay. Reminding everyone to take breaks. If you're thirsty as the guide, I bet your clients are thirsty. If you're hungry, maybe we take a snack break. If you're noticing people having physical symptoms of stress, checking in with them. Also having scheduled break times. So if you're doing a full day workshop, making sure you've got time for snacks, time for lunch, time to go to the bathroom. Also letting people know where we're going to do these things, because a lot of times that can be stressful in and of itself. Is there a bathroom nearby? If not, how do I use the bathroom? So making sure survivors are aware of all of these things prior to going on the trip. Some physical symptoms of stress in related to climbing. So shaky legs on a climb. We call it Elvis leg, because your leg might start shaking and it looks almost like the dances Elvis used to do. So checking in with a client then, hey, do you need to take a break? Just sit back in your harness and let's shake it out for a minute. Heavy breathing or a lack of breathing can also be one. Very often I'm reminding my clients to keep breathing. Flushed skin. So if somebody's wearing a tank top and you can see their back turning red, The flushed skin can mean they're not breathing and their body's not getting the oxygen it needs. So reminders to keep breathing, and then even dissociating. So if they're about to go over the edge rappelling, like this client here, if they're starting to zone out, checking in with them, helping to ground them. So these physical symptoms of stress are, again, they're pretty specific to climbing. However, certain ones are also related to hiking and other fields as well. We also want to check in on participants because we know that often survivors can inaccurately assess their physical abilities, their stamina, what is dangerous, and how to be safe. We often can see survivors either overextending themselves or under challenging themselves. Both of these are survival mechanisms that often come from trying to control a situation. So either tamping down those feelings of uncomfort to just say, I just need to get through and I'll be fine. That's a very common trauma response. We see that a lot if we are doing hiking. So if I'm taking a group backpacking for a few days and somebody's saying, oh, I have a blister, but it's no big deal. Talking through that. Okay, well, we should check your shoes. We should make sure it doesn't get worse. That's one common thing, or that happens a lot with ice climbing too, getting the right size boots before we take folks out. We can see people pushing themselves beyond what they're comfortable with because they feel like they have to for the group dynamic. So making sure to remind people that any level is great. If you get 1 foot off the ground, that is a success. A success could be tying your figure 8 knot. It does not need to be climbing the hardest climb on the wall. We also see people being very hypervigilant and saying, I don't even want to try, or I don't feel comfortable doing that at all. So being extremely risk avoidant. And so helping to support them through thinking through, we have our comfort zone, our push zone, and our panic zone. With those clients, we need to be very careful that we're getting them in their push zone, but not into that panic zone. So they're challenging themselves, but they're not getting to the point of being so afraid that they'll never try it again. I've had clients who come to the first day of class and say, you know what, this isn't for me. That's okay. You tried something new. That's amazing. And I guarantee if I'm supportive in that way, that person might try again if they want to. But again, it's their choice. So always making sure that we're never shaming somebody for not doing it or pushing somebody to do something they're not comfortable with. Because again, that's just going to trigger a lot of emotions of not feeling safe. Other concerns to be thinking about with survivors, natural elements can be, again, they can push us into that push zone, but they can also push us into that panic zone. So rain and lightning, bugs and cleanliness are all very common triggers for survivors because, again, these are things that they might not have control over. So when we're thinking about rain and lightning, for example, if we're going backpacking for a few days, making sure to have extra rain gear, letting clients know beforehand to bring what clothes to bring, how to stay dry, making sure everyone has the right gear beforehand, making sure that we do a lightning drill, for example, if we're up high in the mountains so that people know how to stay safe. Making sure to have these conversations, again, in a pre-trip meeting. Also, I would always recommend before taking people on a long-term backpacking trip that you've done those small steps beforehand. So taking people on a day hike, talking people through how to set up camp, those types of things before doing a long-term trip. Bugs are another one. People just, when you feel those creepy crawlies, it can really trigger a lot of emotions. So making sure to have extra bug spray, making sure to let people know if you're going to the Uintas in the summer that there will be bugs. So letting people be aware beforehand and giving them options and resources there. Again, a lot of what I do as a guide relates very closely to what I do as an advocate. I let people know their rights and options. I let them know what they might be seeing, but I don't tell them how to feel about it. That's their life and their choice. If they want to come on the trip, great. But I want to make sure that they have all the resources they need. And if they decide this is for them, I can help them along the way. When it comes to cleanliness, again, if it's a longer term trip, making sure people are aware of cleanliness standards. So will they have access to water? Will they have access to showers? If not, what are their options? How would they shower? How would they clean their bodies off? And normalizing that we all have different hygiene regimens. And it's okay if somebody cleans their face every day on a backpacking trip. That's not weird. That's totally valid. So really normalizing those different levels. So some tips for creating survivor-friendly spaces. I typically give this presentation to guides, but I'm sure you all also can relate to this. You are a leader, not a therapist. So as an advocate, I'm not a therapist either. So really making sure to stay in my role when I'm working with survivors. Because again, I'm not going to be a superhero who can do everything. I want to make sure my survivors know that they are empowered in their community and there are many people who can help. It's not just one person to depend on. Checking in with everybody, making sure that we're checking in to see how everyone's doing, not just people that we assume or know are survivors. Those boundaries and group guidelines up front are super, super important. So making sure that folks know what the boundaries are, what your group agreements are, and also what the environment will look like so that they can make an informed decision if this is the right place for them at the right time. Being inclusive, again, support everyone on the trip. Do treat everyone the same and with that positive respect and support. That should be a huge part of that. Do not foster an attitude of pushing through. So if you're climbing and somebody is not feeling it, we don't need to push them because again, consent is mandatory. So if they're saying no, we want to be sure that we're showing them that their consent and their needs matter. So we do not need to push through. That being said, if we are halfway through a backpacking trip, that might look a little different. So making space for those conversations. And if somebody does have to go the next few miles because going back would be harder, really talking them through that and giving them space to process with you and talk about a safety plan. It might be a different safety plan than we do in our day-to-day as victim survivor advocates, but making a safety plan for that emotional safety. Again, what I really am heartened by with the outdoor industry is that this is changing. The amazing work that Ariel's doing to do prevention work, but also there's been a lot more wilderness first responder mental health training as well. So really making sure that we're creating spaces to support our survivors while also getting them the resources they need afterwards. And confidentiality. So the outdoors can crack us open. When we're vulnerable and in the outdoors, we often feel our feelings tenfold. And so sometimes, and I'd say more often than not, someone will disclose something on a trip, whether it's related to advocacy or other struggles in life. People share, people feel vulnerable and often in a safe space around the campfire. So maintain that information with as much confidentiality as possible. It's not something that we need to share with everybody else, unless you have reporting responsibilities, right? But in general, we want to be confidential and a confidential support space for that survivor. And I'm going to end it here and have plenty of time for questions. The wilderness offers many gifts: spiritual peace, a positive surrender of control, a feeling of connection, and a new sense of empowerment. Seeing others work in harmony with nature and experiencing it herself can help a survivor gain positive memories through her body, which was often experienced as a source of pain because of abuse, and to recover a sense of pride in herself and her body. And that's by Denise Mitten, who did a really fantastic research study on the support spaces of outdoors for survivors. So if you all have any questions, me and Ariel are here. I will stop sharing my screen now. And thank you all for your time.
Yeah, if anyone has any questions, you can pop those right into chat. That was a really, really good presentation. Covered so much stuff, a lot of stuff that I didn't even think about.
Absolutely, Haley. I can send the art. I have a couple of articles that I used for some of my statistics. I'm happy to send those to you.
You're welcome to send those to me, and then I can send those out to the group.
That would be great. Thanks, Andy.
Wow, well, maybe we don't have any questions. Maybe you covered everything that folks were thinking, were curious about. Yeah, that was a lot of really, really great. I love it. I'm just excited. That was a lot of really great information. So the recording will be available hopefully later today. It does take some time to upload, and sometimes those upload times can vary. But yeah, it'll be available on UCASA's YouTube page. I will send additional resources that Ariel and Jessica supply to me. And thank you everyone for attending. I hope you learned a lot. I know I did. And have a fabulous day.